I have previously concluded that games always have rules. However, we have not discussed at any length what rules are. Understanding rules is quite central to understanding games and to understanding the principles of winning arguments. To understand rules, it is also helpful to compare the meaning of the word rule with the meaning of the word law. Since the terms are close in meaning, comparing and contrasting the meanings of the terms is informative about both. Therefore, we will embark on a unified analysis of rules and laws. There are many different laws and sets of laws of varying kinds, degrees, and scopes of importance and validity. Examples of laws, or at any rate things that people call laws, include the laws and regulations of each state, region, municipality, and so forth. Religious systems of law, such as Sharia law, the Ten Commandments, and Talmudic law. The laws of physics, chemistry, biology, statistics, logic, and mathematics, and other fields of study which have produced laws. Satirical laws, like Murphy's Law and Godwin's Law. Sociological laws, like Duverger's Law. Mystical laws, like the law of attraction and the law of one, and so forth. Examples of rules, or at any rate things that people call rules, include, firstly, the rules of any game. Secondly, there are many rules, or things that people call rules, which are not literally rules of any game, such as the monotone rules, the right-hand rule, the 5-second rule and other rules of thumb, unspoken rules, rules of etiquette, rules of grammar, and rules of inference and logic, which we will discuss at length later in the section titled Logic. What kinds of things can follow rules? Clearly, humans can follow rules. Systems of physical objects can follow rules, as for example, all systems of medium-sized physical objects seem to follow the laws of Newtonian physics. Arguments can follow rules. For example, an argument can be logically valid, meaning it proceeds only according to logically correct rules of inference. Correct, fully detailed mathematical proofs are examples of logically valid arguments. In short, many things, human and non-human, can obey rules. I am not aware of any counterexamples to the following generalization. All things we ordinarily call rules are defined and established by humans. This generalization does not necessarily extend to laws. Many laws are clearly defined and established by humans, such as the laws of the legal systems of states, regions, and municipalities. Other laws, arguably, are not defined and established by humans. Though descriptions of physical theories, such as Newtonian physics, are products of humans, some would argue that Newtonian physics, or some hypothetical complete physical theory, is a description of laws of nature that exist objectively, independently of humans, regardless of whether we know about said laws. If laws of nature exist objectively, then they weren't established by humans. So as a further example, many would argue that systems of religious law, such as Sharia law or the Ten Commandments, were created by God and therefore not defined or established by humans. In summary, some, but arguably not all, laws are defined and established by humans, whereas essentially all things people call rules are defined and established by humans, so far as the author knows. And this is things that people ordinarily call rules. So there is some potential overlap between the categories of rules and laws. For example, the following statement seems fair. The laws of Newtonian physics are rules describing the motion of physical bodies. From that statement, it follows that the laws of Newtonian physics are both rules and laws. If we accept that there are many, or in fact any, things which we can reasonably call both rules and laws, then it follows that there are no properties which all rules have and all laws lack, or vice versa. Is every rule a law? Is every law a rule? The laws of chess and the rules of the universe are odd-sounding phrases, probably, to most native English speakers. The laws of chess sounds odd, perhaps, because it suggests that the rules of chess have some quality of inevitability, whereas in fact people regularly play variants of chess, cheat at chess, misunderstand the rules of chess, etc. The rules of the universe sounds odd, perhaps, because there's nothing we ordinarily call a rule that governs something as big and grand as the universe. Only things we ordinarily call laws apply at this scale. These phrases, the laws of chess and the rules of the universe, are still probably understandable in context, and they need not have the illogical connotations we have described for them, but they can refer simply to the rules of chess and the laws of the universe, respectively. Our linguistic experiments suggest, firstly, that there is a delicate difference in meaning between rule and law, and secondly, that there is a great deal of similarity in meaning between rule and law. The similarity in meaning between rule and law is so great that one hypothesis one might venture is that rule and law are essentially different words for the same concept, which we apply habitually to different kinds of things without any deeper distinction existing. One way of describing the hypothesized vague habitual distinction is to observe that laws are usually broad in their domain of applicability, whereas rules are usually narrow in their domain of applicability. One objection to the view that rule and law are essentially the same concept is as follows. All things we habitually call rules seem to be made by humans. A qualifier to this is that rules can also be made by the creations of humans, as when computer programs generate rules for other programs to follow. Rules govern humans and the operations of the creations of humans. Laws, on the other hand, according to the objection, are not always created by humans, and sometimes they govern nature rather than humans or the creations of humans. If one accepts the foregoing, then one will acknowledge a substantive distinction between rules and laws. For the sake of clear nomenclature, I will use the term natural law to refer to laws which are not created by humans. By definition, then, natural laws include any laws created by God, if God exists. I am not assuming that any natural laws exist, but we have a word for any that do exist, as well as any that don't exist. The nature and extent of the difference in meaning between rule and law is, at the end of the day, a question of opinion. The subtleties of the distinction are interesting. What's perhaps more interesting, though, is looking more into the basic meanings of the terms rule and law. It would be helpful towards that goal to establish more relations between rule and other terms we have studied. We have generalized that games and game-like activities follow rules. Can we also generalize that rules occur in the context of games and game-like activities? Let's look back to the examples of rules I gave. Do all of them occur in the context of games or game-like activities? Let's examine. The monotone rules are rules for legal proceedings, which are a game-like activity used to settle legal cases. The right-hand rule is a minigame for remembering orientation conventions in 3D vector math. The 5-second rule is a minigame lacking any factual basis, which we play to justify eating food off the floor. The rule of 72 is a rule of thumb that one can employ in the game-like activity of investment portfolio construction. One illustration that investment portfolio construction is a game-like activity is that a number of games have been closely modeled after the activity of trading the stock market. Trading the stock market has, in turn, drawn comparison to gambling games such as poker. Bearing in mind the flexibility of the concept game or game-like activity, it seems fair to generalize that rules occur in the context of games or game-like activities. This generalization gives us further conceptual bearing for thinking about rules. We can always think about rules in the context of games or game-like activities. This generalization is violated by the statement the laws of Newtonian physics are rules governing the motion of physical bodies, if we consider the laws of Newtonian physics to be objective features of nature, rather than a human-constructed system for understanding nature. In other words, at least one of these four things is false. 1. Rules always occur in the context of games or game-like activities. 2. The laws of Newtonian physics are objective features of nature, rather than a human-constructed system for understanding nature. 3. The laws of Newtonian physics are rules. 4. Nature itself is not a game-like activity. If statements 1 to 3 are true, then we can conclude that nature itself is a game-like activity, since if the laws of Newtonian physics are objective features of nature, then the context to which they apply is nature itself. If the laws of Newtonian physics are rules, then it follows that nature itself is a game-like activity, in direct contradiction of statement 4. Hence, we are required by logic to reject at least one of statements 1 through 4. All of these statements can be thought of as terminological rules. Statement 1 says that if we're willing to call something a rule, we should be willing to call its context a game or game-like activity. Statement 3 says we should be willing to refer to the laws of Newtonian physics as rules. Statement 4 says we should not be willing to describe nature itself as a game-like activity. Statement 2 is a compound of a terminological rule and a statement about the world. We can think of it as a combination into one statement of the following two statements. Statement 2W. There are objective laws of nature correlating to human-constructed descriptions of the laws of Newtonian physics. Statement 2T. We should use the phrase, the laws of Newtonian physics, to refer to said objective laws of nature, as opposed to using the phrase, the laws of Newtonian physics, to refer to said human-constructed descriptions. Statement 2W is a statement about the world, whereas statement 2T is a terminological rule. For statement 2T to make sense, statement 2W must be true. If statement 2W is not true, then there are no objective laws of nature correlating to the laws of Newtonian physics, making said objective laws of nature in statement 2T unable to refer to anything. One can accept statement 2W and reject statement 2T. If one neither accepts nor rejects statement 2W, if one maintains that one does not know whether or not statement 2W is true, one can still reject statement 2T. My view is that I can't accept or reject statement 2W because I don't have the knowledge to say whether it's true or false. Why is that? For starters, Newtonian physics is known to be correct only in restricted contexts and to a certain degree of approximation. Newtonian physics was formulated by inductive generalization from a certain body of phenomena, namely the motions of objects that can be seen with the naked eye. When it comes to very small objects, very large-scale phenomena, very high speeds, very high energy levels, etc., Newtonian physics ceases to correctly predict our observations, and other theories, like quantum physics and general relativity, are required to get the right answers. Quantum physics and general relativity, in turn, have proven extremely difficult to unify into a single logically consistent theory explaining all observations. All of this suggests that Newtonian physics, as well as all existing theories, represent only our best current state of understanding. This casts doubt on the idea of assuming that the laws of Newtonian physics, as described by physicists, are direct correlates of objective laws of nature, rather than being human constructions that approximate the actual behavior of nature to a higher degree of accuracy in a wide yet limited variety of cases. Here is an additional reason to doubt statement 2W. As Kant has argued in the Critique of Pure Reason, we cannot have direct knowledge of the world outside ourselves. Our sense perceptions and experiences are constructions of our minds, which are presumed to reflect an outside world through many layers of indirection, through processes such as light transmission, retinal stimulation, edge detection, object detection, associative cognition, etc. Our theories of the world are abstractions over our observations, i.e., generalizations over a series of sense perceptions had by humans over time. Yet we have no direct observational knowledge that there was a past, that there is an external world, or that there are other minds. The only thing we observe directly is our own conscious experience in the present moment. Then can we, with intellectual fairness, assume that the outside world, a thing of which we have no direct experience, is made in the image of our models of the outside world. Statement 2W is in doubt on multiple fronts, and probably many are not willing to assume that it's true. Hence, we should not assume statement 2t makes sense, since for statement 2t to make sense, statement 2w must be true. Hence, we should not follow statement 2t as a terminological rule. In other words, we should not understand the phrase, the laws of Newtonian physics, to refer to objective laws of nature correlating to the laws of Newtonian physics as described by humans. Instead, in this text, I will use the phrase, the laws of Newtonian physics, to refer to said human constructed descriptions, or to the ideas those descriptions denote. The same problem we have encountered with Newtonian physics occurs with other phrases that refer either to laws of nature or to human constructed descriptions of supposed laws of nature. Examples of phrases presenting this problem include the laws of general relativity, the laws of quantum mechanics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of biology, etc. In all such cases, in this text we shall interpret the phrases as referring to human constructed descriptions of laws or to the ideas expressed by those descriptions, and not to objective laws of nature. This is, as with the case of the laws of Newtonian physics, not an attempt to say that there aren't corresponding objective laws of nature, though many of the same difficulties with asserting positively the existence of such laws present themselves in other cases as well. It's simply a terminological choice, driven by the desire not to take a position in this text on what objective laws of nature exist. This terminological choice collapses a substantive distinction in meaning we've seen between the terms rule and law, namely that law can refer to laws of nature, whereas rule seems to refer to the rules of humans. Under our sharpened terminology, the natural laws we know, the laws of physics, chemistry, etc., are just a kind of rule. For example, the laws of Newtonian physics are the rules of the game of Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is a game-like activity that humans practice in order to build bridges, go to the moon, etc. Similarly for the rest of natural science. Do any distinctions in meaning remain for us between rule and law? Let's consider the case of the laws of legal systems of nations, states, municipalities, etc., or legal laws, as I shall say. Are legal laws rules? It seems natural to say so. By our principles, that means that legal laws are rules that apply in the context of some game or game-like activity. The contexts that the laws of a legal system apply to are all situations in the jurisdiction of the legal system, about which laws have been made in the given legal system. So in what ways are situations to which legal laws apply like games, and in what ways are they unlike games? Situations to which legal laws apply are always like games in the respect that in them, one is required to follow rules. Since laws can be made about anything, situations about which there are legal laws can be arbitrarily non-game-like. Let's ask, then, about the game-like and non-game-like characteristics of typical situations about which there are legal laws. Let's start with violence. Most forms of violence are illegal in most jurisdictions. Violence is not a very game-like thing. What laws against violence say is that one should never commit covered forms of violence. In other words, laws against violence require people to follow the rules of non-violence in most of their dealings. In what ways is non-violence like a game, and in what ways is it unlike a game? Non-violence postulates certain rules, which vary depending who you're asking. These rules usually amount to prohibitions on violating the bodies of other people, where violating the bodies of other people ranges from violations such as touching somebody without permission, to violations such as mangling a person limb from limb. These rules serve the purpose of preventing people from being harmed and maintaining social cohesion by prohibiting interpersonal conflicts from escalating to the point of violence. Rules of nonviolence are based on the observation, long validated by history, that violence almost always leads to consequences more deplorable than the problems it was trying to solve. The following suggests itself. Nonviolence is part of the rules we follow in the game of society. On this way of thinking, Society is a game humans play whose purposes include the survival and reproduction of the society and its members. Different societies are different games with different rules. However, all of the ones I'm aware of include rules against violence, because games of society accomplish their purposes better when such rules are instituted. We can immediately generalize this answer as follows. Legal laws are among the rules of the social game that the members of a society play in order to constitute that society. Thus far, I have gotten rid of two distinctions between laws and rules. I have terminologically separated objective laws of nature out of usages of the term law in its unqualified usage. I have also categorized legal laws as rules of the social games that members of a society play in order to constitute that society. Aside from the qualifier that objective laws of nature are obviously laws in some sense, can we draw any distinction between laws and rules within the terminological framework I have set up? It seems not. Within this terminological framework, laws, in the unqualified sense, seem to be a type of rules in every case. It still feels odd to speak of the laws of chess. In the terminological framework we've arrived at, we have no substantive distinction between rules and laws, but there is still a distinction of habitual application of the two terms to different things. The laws of Newtonian physics are rules we are generally happy to call laws. The rules of chess, not so much. In general, we seem to apply the term law to rules that cover a larger jurisdiction than other rules. So let's summarize what I've said about rules up to this point. Rules are defined and established by humans. Pretty much anything can follow rules. Games have rules, and rules occur in the context of games and game-like activities. There is no substantive difference in meaning between rule and law, understanding the unqualified term law to exclude laws of nature, but to include human-constructed descriptions thereof. Laws are a kind of rule, but the term law isn't applied to all rules, but only to certain rules whose jurisdictions are particularly wide. What else can we say about rules? Essentially any rule can be written in the form of a statement, possibly a very long one. The statement of a rule says what is true in the context of the rule if the rule is followed. When what the rule says isn't true, we say the rule has been broken. Rules are of two types: descriptive rules and prescriptive rules. The statement of a descriptive rule says that empirically, the statement of a rule holds true. The laws of Newtonian physics are examples of descriptive rules. The statement of a prescriptive rule, on the other hand, states that people should choose to follow the rule. Legal laws are examples of prescriptive rules. Anybody can state a descriptive rule. Descriptive rules can be correct or incorrect in a few different ways. If the statement of a descriptive rule is true in all cases, the rule is universally correct. If the statement of a descriptive rule is true in the great majority of cases, with rare exceptions, the rule is correct as a generalization. Descriptive rules that only hold in some cases are also interesting, but probably rule isn't the best word for them. Maybe pattern is better. A descriptive rule is correct or incorrect, regardless of who states it. There is no authority besides reality on what descriptive rules are correct. Prescriptive rules work a little differently. Anybody can state prescriptive rules, but typically they need to persuade others to consent to follow them, which others are typically free not to do. Prescriptive rules are also made by various rule-making entities with self-proclaimed or recognized authority based on consensus and or force. Examples of rule-making authorities include governments, international organizations like the UN and the EU, standards organizations like ISO and ANSI, and so forth. Prescriptive rules can only be about human behavior. Descriptive rules can be about people or things, but descriptive rules about human behavior will never hold universally, because people have freedom of choice. Dictionaries are examples of sets of descriptive rules about human behavior. Dictionaries describe the senses of words, as most commonly used by English speakers. English dictionaries do, that is. However, English speakers can, and occasionally do, use words in senses not described in dictionaries. Dictionaries can also be thought of as sets of prescriptive rules. For example, if you're of the opinion that people ought to spell words the way they're found in the dictionary, or if you're of the opinion that people ought to use words that are in the dictionary only in senses defined in the dictionary. What is it that rules and laws do in the world? Rules and laws have effects. How can we describe their effects? All rules and laws bind us and or the world in some sense and at least in some cases. The sense in which rules and laws are binding varies. The laws of physics are binding in the sense that physical theories generally postulate laws that always hold within their domain of applicability, so that any counterexamples would falsify the theory. Sociological laws, like Duverger's law and Godwin's law, are expected to have some counterexamples, and counterexamples are not necessarily considered to undermine the whole law. They are binding in the sense that they represent notable statistical trends that one tends to observe over time. The laws of governments are binding in the sense and to the extent that they can be enforced and offenses are punishable. Many consider the laws of governments to be binding in a moral sense in many cases. It seems to be a consensus among the people I speak to that laws of governments are not always binding in a moral sense, but I imagine this perspective is not shared by the whole world. For example, many Islamists undoubtedly would agree that Sharia law is binding in a moral sense. Many believe in many cases that international law is binding on states in a moral sense. International law is binding in another sense, and to the extent that it is enforceable and offenses are punishable, which varies widely from case to case. I can't think of any counterexamples to the generalization that all rules and laws are binding to something in some sense in some cases. This, then, is one truism about rules and laws which I will accept. All rules and laws are binding. Let's try to study further the phenomenon of rules and laws binding phenomena. If we look at the phenomenon of binding, it seems to divide into two distinct subtypes. The case where the rules and laws are defined by a centralized authority with the ability to enforce rules and laws, and the case where there is no such centralized authority. Let us call these authoritative binding and organic binding, respectively. The distinction between authoritative and organic binding is not sharp. In most cases, centralized rule-making authorities have authority due to some level of consent or agreement to be ruled among the people who follow their rules. In many cases, there are varying levels of force used to enforce the authority of rule-making authorities. In the case of governments, it seems they are generally able to rule only by a combination of general consent and the ability to use force. The distinction between authoritative and organic binding is not the same as the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive rules. There are prescriptive rules which are authoritatively binding, like laws, and prescriptive rules which are organically binding, like standards of common decency. As far as I'm aware, there are no descriptive rules which are authoritatively binding. I think all descriptive rules are organically binding. Prescriptive rules can be made authoritatively binding on people if one is able to use authority to instill sufficient fear in people of the consequences of breaking the rules that they follow the rules. Organic binding of prescriptive rules can also be based on fear, if people fear the consequences of breaking the rules, but not because they fear retribution by an authority. An example is the organically binding prescriptive rule, "Don't eat mushrooms you are unable to identify." Prescriptive rules can also be organically binding on the basis of things other than fear. For example, rules of grammar are organically binding not as a result of fear, but mostly as a result of mostly unconscious mental processes of language formation, which follow rules of grammar in order to facilitate communication. So a prescriptive rule can be organically binding in a given social game if there is an approximation of a Nash equilibrium around following the rule. What I mean by this is, for essentially every player in the game, their incentives mean that they are better off following the rule as long as those around them continue to follow the rule. In such a situation, people may violate the rule, but they generally experience consequences from doing so. Others observe and anticipate those consequences, and as a result, people generally follow the rule. One simple kind of case of an approximate Nash equilibrium around following a rule is the kind of case where each player is individually better off following the rule, regardless of what others do. Don't eat mushrooms you are unable to identify is an example of a rule like this. In other cases, whether people are better off following the rule depends on whether or not others follow the rule. For example, if others are working hard to get US dollars in your area, then you're probably better off if you work hard to get US dollars, so that you can buy things from all the people working for dollars in your area. In summary, here are the key statements I have made about rules. 1. Rules are defined and established by humans. 2. Pretty much anything can follow rules. 3. Games have rules, and rules occur in the context of games and game-like activities. 4. There is no substantive difference in meaning between rule and law, understanding the unqualified term law to exclude laws of nature, but to include human-constructed descriptions thereof. 5. Laws are a kind of rule, but the term law isn't applied to all rules, but only to certain rules whose jurisdictions are particularly wide. 6. Essentially any rule can be written in the form of a statement, saying what is true when the rule is followed. 7. Rules are of two types, descriptive rules and prescriptive rules. 8. All rules and laws bind us and/or the world, in some sense and at least in some cases. 9. The phenomenon of binding is of two types, authoritative and organic binding. Descriptive rules are always organically binding. 10. Prescriptive rules can be organically binding in a game if there is an approximation of a Nash equilibrium around following the rules.